Last week, I was talking a bit about the book Wrapped and how important a book this was and how it was an interesting parallel to Buddha's brain and different approaches to similar topics. And I wanted to read you the just a section of the back cover of the book, which is a part of a review from the Washington Post by Paul Bloom, a well-known author, a commentary on the book Wrapped. And I think it has a nice little summary at the same time. Uh, Take seriously, if just for a few minutes, what Winifred Gallagher, she's the author of Wrapped, describes as the grand unifying theory of psychology. Your life is the sum of what you focus on. Then consider the main implication of this. The skillful management of attention is the key to happiness and fulfillment. Therefore, live the focused life. Now, I hope this fits in with what we were talking about last week. Okay, it's a very important paragraph, and I think in just a few words, he really says something very wise that relates also to what's being done in Buddha's brain. Your life is the sum of what you focus on. For example, as we discussed last week, to choose to be happy. I mean, you can choose to be happy, or you can choose to be depressed about things. Probably most people never thought before this recent literature has been developed, never thought that this was something we can decide for ourselves. But the studies in the physiology of the brain show that if we make that choice to take the time to dwell not on matters of things that hurt us or depress us or things from the past that we've done wrong or that we think others have wronged us and we can't get on with it, it pays to know that, hey, if you focus on happiness, it will make your life happier because your brain trains itself, okay? Again, going back to the concept of what's called the plasticity of the brain that was never known before, only just not even a few years ago, that the brain is a lot more supple than we would have thought. That it not only determines what goes out, but it's also determined by what goes in. And this is a life-changing sense of knowledge. My father was born in 1910. It was a particularly bad year to be born in, because that means he was of that generation that lived through World War I. In my father's case, born in France, in Paris, so he lived during the bombardment of the Germans bombarding Paris. In other words, he lived his life spending every night of his youth in the Paris subways because Paris was being bombarded, and his mother would bring him down in the subways every night, and he would be hearing the bombs and experiencing the repercussions. As if that wasn't enough, by the time he was a young man in the 1930s, starting his first jobs, then came the Depression. So whatever plans and hopes people had at that time never seemed to materialize. So that was fine. Then after World War after the Depression, first was World War I, then the Depression. Okay, then after that they think, okay, now we can get on with our lives. But then came World War II, and people like my father, although in their 30s, were not supposed to be drafted, but as the war lingered on, even people in their late 30s were drafted, and so my father was back in the, in a depressing state, in the army, having to fight. As a result, I mean, think about how many relationships, how many marriages must have been lost, because of the separation, and all the things that happened to that generation, okay? Being born first into World War I, then the generation of the Depression, and then on top of that, World War II. My father was often unhappy, and this is a syndrome of people from that generation. They're known to be a rather unhappy group of people. We could see why, okay? We could sympathize with that too. When I started studying this as a university student, I really understood what my father must have been going through and why he was never really happy. He rarely smiled. And it made it easier for me to cope with his pain. And I understood that he wasn't alone, because whereas my group of friends were a pretty happy and optimistic group of young men and women, his group of friends were a pretty pessimistic group who had experienced World War I, the Depression, World War II, and had no hope for the future. And even though they had everything to be happy about now, because the world was at peace, North America was a damn good place to live, lots of opportunities, that generation just couldn't find it within themselves to be happy. And it's really sad. I ultimately succeeded in making him happy, finally, in his old age. It was, to me, one of the greatest accomplishments of my life. When he was in his 90s, I succeeded in just making him feel relaxed in who he was, what he had done, how people feel about him. And it was something great. I mean, the last years of his life, he was in his 90s up until 96 when he died, and he was really happy those years, and it was really wonderful. But this question is something that almost obsessed me for many, many years. Why is it that some people can choose to be unhappy? Like, this generation didn't choose. It was thrust upon them. They didn't know about the plasticity of the brain, right? And it's really terrible. I mean, as I say, it's not just my father, but that whole cohort of people. I knew all his friends, and they were always sad, and as I say, always pessimistic. Why wouldn't they be? But how is it that so many people who live in the richest country in the world, with all the greatest advantages here of life in Canada, we've got oil in the ground. When I say the richest country in the world, I mean it. Okay? We may not be quite as rich as the US in terms of per capita income, although we're getting pretty close now as their dollar falls and our dollar goes up. But that doesn't matter. It's all the oil that we have in the ground, okay? The great mountains that will attract tourism for generations to come. We're on 3 oceans and all the riches that the oceans will have. We have every major mineral you can think of to mine in Canada. We have fertile soil. We have Quebec to provide le joie de vivre. We have everything that a country could want. And unlike Greece or Spain or Portugal or even France, which will be spending a long time trying to get out of these budgetary situations, we don't have that same type of problem. Yeah, I mean, we do have a debt, but it's nothing compared to other countries. Not as good as China, which owns all the money in the world, or close to it, but it's pretty good. So why are so many people so unhappy in Canada? I mean, it's one of the things that really amazes me, that with all the people who were so unhappy from that generation born in 1910, thereabouts, I can understand that. I can even understand when I was in high school, my first year of high school, I met this boy named Carl Freeman. And like myself, he was really, really interested in athletics. And we started training together. And we both became very, very serious. And our cohort of friends, we were fanatical about training, every day training after school, after school pizza, and then after the pizza training, And Carl Freeman was very interesting because one day he invited me over to his house where I met his mother, who looked like a walking dead person. I didn't really understand, she would walk through the house like in a daze. And his father was like really a fantastic guy, always smiling, always friendly, very optimistic. They were refugees from Germany, and they had every sense of optimism for the future, living in the U.S. And one day I asked Carl, what's the matter with your mother? Why is she like that? And he said, well, I was born in a concentration camp, and my parents had lived at Auschwitz, and she never got over that. They did experiments on her. They did all sorts of things. He said, you don't even want to know the things that they did to her. And she's just living but yet really not living. But the father was so different. And the father had lived through the same experiences, of course not tortured as much, obviously, as his wife. But I always wondered, how is it that this guy, after living in Auschwitz, after living all those years as a Jew in Germany, can come to America, can be so optimistic about life, can be so cheerful, so smiling, so caring for his wife, trying to bring her out of it, but even if he couldn't, making a life for his 2 children as well as his wife as best as he can. How could they do that? I mean, that's really a remarkable thing. And of course, it has to make us think that from this day on, as karateka, okay, when we understand the importance of focus and concentration on karateka, and how that we as karateka, and based on not just our training in karate-do as a Buddhist art, but also our understanding of modern physiology and neurology, of how we have more power now than we could have ever imagined, as I say, even a couple of years ago. That we have that responsibility as karateka to make our own lives and to be examples to other people, okay? That there's no reason to be unhappy. There's no reason to be pessimistic, okay? We have that power within ourselves if we choose to take the steps to use it. I want to read that second paragraph of this once again, and I just want you to listen a little more carefully than you did before. Take seriously, if just for a few minutes, what Winifred Gallagher describes as the grand unifying theory of psychology. Your life is the sum of what you focus on. Then consider the main implication. The skillful management of attention is the key to happiness and fulfillment. Live the focused life. 2,500 years ago, the Buddha taught the importance of attention. It was the center of his philosophy. That when we are focused, when we pay attention to the world around us, even if we are poor, we can flourish as human beings. Now remember how interesting this is, because the Buddha was the son of an Indian king. He was the prince. He was incredibly rich. And he gave up all that as Siddhartha Gautama and left that life and became a wandering monk, eventually with a huge following. Remember, Buddha means enlightened one. It's a title. He's not the only one who had that title. There are many Buddhists, but he's the one who became sort of the Buddha. Huh? Sort of like saying the sage with a capital S. Huh? So it's really interesting. 2,500 years ago, he lived and was teaching about attention. This is the foundation of martial arts, because martial arts comes from the teachings of the Buddha. You've often heard me say in the dojo, it's not about punches and kicks that make you strong. It's about learning to focus, to concentrate, to build the power of mind that will give us all the discipline to be truly strong, to be whom we want to be. And it's important that, that each of us take that responsibility seriously. Because unless the dojo as a whole has this, then we lose something, okay? If it's just a couple of people out of 100 or 200 or whatever, with people we have, then it's not going to happen. But if we're all of that mind, if we all refuse to accept that we're going to bring people down, but say that we're going to bring people up, just like we refuse to accept that anything is going to bring us down, it helps the dojo. It helps the environment of the dojo. Everyone understand what I mean, huh?
Yes.
Okay, this is really important. Like one person punching like this, I mean, everyone, it brings down everyone. First of all, people have to take time to try and explain to the person, that no, that's not the way we punch. But if the person is not concentrating, can't focus, it's like a virus in the dojo. It spreads to everyone. So learning to focus is an extremely important part, not just of Buddhism, but what martial arts training is about. We have to remember that Buddhism developed in India 2,500 years ago. About 1,000 years later, from 600 BCE to 600 of the Common Era, about 1,000 years later, an Indian monk named Daruma traveled from India to China, across the Himalayan mountains. Can you imagine that? Crossing the Himalayan mountains to bring Buddhism to China. Now, there had been other communities, Buddhist communities that had been set up in China before Dharma. But Dharma became the most famous of these wandering monks 1,000 years after Buddha that came to China. And he fundamentally changed Buddhism. Number one, because he was in China. So it ceased to be an Indian philosophy, and its development in India was different. The development in China was unique to China. And by the way, this is the form of Buddhism which later came into Japan. It was based upon what's called the Rinzai sect of Zen. Zen, remember, means meditation. So Buddhism in India, believe it or not, never flourished because India had Hinduism. And they considered it, or they succeeded in making it understood to the Indian population that the teachings of the Buddha were heresy. And it never really developed in India until just now, just recently. And its development has been rather rapid in India. This could cause great trouble, okay? Especially since Tibetan Buddhists, who refugees from the invasion of China, the invasion of Tibet from the Chinese who now occupy Tibet. And so these Tibetan monks want to keep the peace. This Tibetan community in India, they want to keep the peace. They don't want to get in trouble with the Hindus who are going to feel you're trying to propagate this new religion, Tibetan Buddhism in India. So it's a very tenuous situation. But Buddhism developed in different ways in the different communities. So we have a whole new form of Indian Buddhism now, which, as I say, is developing rather rapidly. The Tibetan Buddhist community has spread throughout the world, and we have Tibetan communities in Canada as well as in the United States. Of course, China, Japan, Korea are predominantly Buddhist, but their Buddhism is not necessarily the same. But Dharuma's Buddhism, the man who brought Indian Buddhism to China, and then which eventually came into Japan and into Korea, this Buddhism was based upon training in the martial arts. And just like Buddha had been very physical, okay? Even as an old man, he didn't like so much zazen, sitting meditation. He much preferred dozen. In fact, it's little known amongst most people and amongst most Buddhists, as a matter of fact. He preferred walking meditation. Well, dozen means active meditation. It could be walking, it could be karate-do, it could be archery, it could be brush painting. Okay, the idea being that the meditation is through doing something as opposed to sitting. Now, this new form of Buddhism that came to China and to Japan, by the way, many of you know the temple, the Buddhist temple that developed, the Shaolin temple that developed in China. The focus of many movies, okay? But such a temple really exists. And many of you probably know that when the Chinese Revolution was successful, one of the things that Mao Zedong tried to do is destroy the Shaolin Temple and tried to kill all the Buddhist monks. Fortunately, he didn't succeed, but a lot has been lost in the process. But that sort of transition from Indian to Chinese to Japanese has kept alive this original Indian tradition of Buddhism as a part of martial arts as a part of Dozen and its relationship to Buddhism. Buddhism was meant as a way of peace, but a way of peace based upon strength. That peace without strength is meaningless. We can never accomplish anything in life. We can never make our values really alive. One of the best examples of that is in the book Samurai Spirit, the story of the monk with a punch. Okay, and there are so many versions of that story. It's a really beautiful story about a village being terrorized, and of course this is a very common situation both in China and Japan and Korea in those times when there was no police force, there was no army that took care of people. The army protected the emperor, okay, and was used to hurt the people, so to say. But it's an important idea, okay, an ideal of what Buddhism is. Now, I'm going to add to the complexity of our story about attention and focus by telling you another aspect of Buddhism that I'm going to develop a sort of another thread now, okay? And I think you're going to enjoy these two stories that I'm going to recount now, okay? The first story is not a Buddhist story. It comes from the New York Times. A researcher in psychology at Yale University doing work with children. And the question, it's an old question, are children moral or immoral? Or Sigmund Freud used to say they're amoral, okay? Whatever that means. But it's been a big debate for thousands of years, I guess as long as children have been around, huh? So, are children moral or are they immoral? And what this researcher has been trying to do, he and his wife and their research assistant, is try to create experimental conditions that can tell us with some degree of certainty whether children are moral or immoral, or amoral in between. And I think this test is absolutely fantastic, okay? So, there's a puppet. And the puppet is in the middle, and there's two puppets on the side. And the puppet has a ball. And they take a 1-year-old child, and they put him in front of this, and it's a puppet show. So kids love puppet shows, right? Adults love puppet shows. Okay. So if the puppet has the ball, and he pushes it to the right, the doll on the right, the puppet on the right, will push it back. And they'll push it a couple of times. And then the puppet in the center will push it to the left, and the guy on the left, okay, the puppet on the left will take the ball, and he'll run away. And the two of them will look at him, with sad looks, as he's running away. So now, okay, they take another scene, they take the puppets away, and they explain to the child, okay, we're going to give you two of the puppets back. I'm sorry, we're going to give you the two puppets back, the one on the right, one on the left, not in the middle. And we're going to put some treats in front of each puppet. So the two puppets are there, the one on the right and the one on the left with the treats in front of them. And the baby is told, okay, take these treats away from whichever puppet you would want. So the babies, almost all the babies, not 100%, but a pretty close range, okay, the puppets take from the one on the left, and they take the treats away like they were told to. But what's on top of that? After they take the treats away, they slap the puppet, okay, then they go away. Now, this is an interesting story about the morality of children. But, there was a little bit of physical action here, okay? But you can't say that he really hurt the puppet. It was just a puppet. But nevertheless, it shows that babies are able, even at 1 year of age, to understand something about moral behavior. Now, when I was reading this, I was fascinated because years ago, when we first moved into this house, which we have a veritable zoo in the backyard, we have raccoons, we have skunks, we have a fox that wanders through here, and because it connects to the ravine, and it's quite fascinating to watch all the wildlife that goes back and forth here. And one day, my daughter Melina and I were sitting at the table there, and we were watching all the wildlife, and there was a mother raccoon climbing up one of the trees just outside here, and she's climbing up, and she's got her 4 or 5, I don't remember, baby raccoons with her. And as she's climbing up the tree, she gets near the top and she jumps to another tree adjacent. And then she calls to the raccoon behind her, and he jumps. And then she calls to the other one, making motions. That one jumps, and that one jumps. And then the last one, I guess that's why he's the last one, going to run to the litter, okay? He's afraid to jump. He's shaking, he's afraid to jump. So the mother keeps beckoning him to come, but he's not coming. So the mother jumps back to the original tree, goes down the tree, and then she slaps him in the face, and then he jumps, okay? And then she pushes from behind, as he goes up to the other end of the tree. This was fascinating to watch, okay? And it reminded me when I was reading this story, okay, how fascinated I was, because animals can't talk. This is the only way they have to communicate. And it's her way of showing what she has to do to convince her child that he can't be the wimp of the litter, right? Okay, he's got to make a life for himself because one day he's not going to have his mother to protect him. And it's interesting because, of course, this story, the original story of the experiments at Yale University, shows something about morality, but also about how parents are necessary to sort of complete the job. Just like this parent was necessary, right? She couldn't have completed the job just by showing him the way. He had to have a sort of a lesson about what's involved here. So when I think of these stories and the relationship between them, it's interesting, their relationship to Buddhism. Because this is one of the fundamental things about Buddhist teaching, is that people, if given the chance, will be moral. If given the chance. Remember last week I talked about prisons, and how the Buddha recognized that to put people in prison will accomplish nothing. Most people are in prison because they're poor, and because they're poor, they steal. And that we have to create the situation where people can have the opportunities to be real people, not starving people who become like animals. It's the same thing. It's the same thing here, to understand the importance that the Buddha placed on the morality of children, the morality that basically people can be good under the right circumstances, and what they're showing here, that children are basically good, but they will still need their parents to lead the way. For example, maybe hitting the puppet was not the best way, and a parent would be able to teach a child these things. It's an important question, because the world will be very different if we think that some people are evil and some people are good, when the question is a lot more complicated than that. Because we already know, like from what the Buddha had said, that if people are poor and miserable, they will steal if they have no other opportunities to be able to get basic food, basic shelter. And the same way that not only under circumstances of poverty, but if children are not brought up well, if they're brought up by hateful parents, by parents who constantly hit them or diminish them, then they won't have the same opportunities to grow up with a sense of morality. Their moral nature will have been taken away from them. Now, this is an important part of Buddhism. Now, I'm going to tell you a third story. Did you like the first two stories? Yeah. The third story is a little more complicated. This is concerning monkeys and tests with monkeys. This is done by the economics department, once again at Yale University. You may wonder, the economics department. Yeah, the economics department, because they wanted to see if monkeys can be taught. If monkeys can be taught finance. Okay. I had a title to this story. Where did I put it? Oh yes, monkeying around with economics. Okay. So the researchers, and remember, this is not the same group of researchers. That was psychologists. They probably wouldn't touch an experiment like this. Like, can monkeys be taught finance? Okay. This is really a brilliant experiment. Okay. So the researchers decided to apply for a small grant, and they received that, and they bought a couple of capuchin, which is small monkeys. They're a fully grown adult is about the size of a 1-year-old baby. Now, the capuchin was a particularly good type of monkey for these types of experiments, because basically they're only interested in two things in the world. One is sex, and the other thing is eating. this was good because if they have too many interests in the world, and it wouldn't be good for the experiment. So what they tried to do is they tried to create a coin that would attract them. So they made something in silver, and it also had a hole in the middle, and they thought that that would attract the monkeys. So they started giving the monkeys, well, they had two cages. One cage was a communal cage for all the monkeys, and one cage where individual monkeys, one or two, would come in for the experiment. And they tried giving the monkeys the coins. And the monkeys, looking at the coins, and they would throw them, they would chew on them, they would, but for months and months and months, nothing was happening. They couldn't get the basic thing that they wanted to get. But after a while, the monkeys became more fascinated with the coins, and the researchers had them, they would give them the coin, and they would bring them a bowl of Jell-O. You know how Jell-O, it's a color and it shimmers. It was fascinating to the monkeys. They really caught on to the monkeys. So they'd want to get the Jell-O, but the researchers wouldn't give them the Jell-O. But they would point to the coins. And I guess finally, after many, many, many months, one monkey took a coin and gave it to the researcher, and he got the Jell-O. And then all the other monkeys started doing the same thing. The next step, they thought, okay, what happens if we raise the price of Jell-O? Okay? So now they come with the Jell-O, and the monkeys try and buy the Jell-O with the coin, and they take it away. And they're going, okay, so some monkey figured it out. Okay, I'll give you your 2 coins, and now I get my Jell-O. Okay? And it was interesting that, now they got used to the idea. And then when they lowered the price, okay, so now instead of asking for 1 coin for Jell-O, now it's 1 coin and you get 2 things of Jell-O. Then they bought more Jell-O. Okay? It's really, really interesting how the monkeys caught on to this. And they had all sorts of thoughts, how they were going to go a little bit more advanced in this. Before they had a chance, the alpha monkey, whose name was Jesse, he one night broke in to the cage where all the money was kept, and he started going crazy in the cage, destroying stuff in the cage. And then when he opened up the door, other monkeys came in, and they all got a hold of the money. And when the researchers tried to come in and get the money back, the monkeys became violent. So the researchers ran out of the cage, like, oh my gosh, what are we doing? So the monkeys ran back into the other cage now with their money, okay? And the researchers were thinking, okay, so what's going to happen now? So one of the monkeys with his coin, one of the male monkeys goes over to the female monkey and gives her a coin. And so the researchers are saying, this is fantastic, because there were some studies years ago that showed, some limited studies, that monkeys have altruistic behavior. This is fantastic. We're seeing altruistic behavior. And then a couple of minutes later, they started having sex. So the researchers are saying, oh my gosh, this is not altruistic behavior. This is the first case of monkey prostitution. So they became fascinated by this. And they started spreading the money around to see what was going to happen. And they realized the first thing that they were doing is that they were teaching monkeys that, like humans, they understand that crime pays. Okay? And like humans, they understand that when you have some money, you might as well do something with it. So anyway, they had all sorts of dreams about what they were going to do next and how they were going to get these grants to be able to further their research. But this is the United States of America where this was done. And Yale said, there's no way, we're not going to touch this. With all the right wing, and the Tea Party now and all these other things, no way we're going to touch this. So the funding went away, and the research is now, in a state of abeyance. Isn't that something? Okay, monkey prostitution, huh? Okay, I wanted to go into a little bit more detail into what I was talking about last week in relation to the book Wrapped. Remember, I was talking about William James, and I had mentioned something very important that I want to repeat here. William James accepted evolution, but not the implication that nature rigidly determines your behavior, making you a ghastly biological robot. As he wrote, the whole sting and excitement of our voluntary life depends on our sense that in it, things are really being decided from one moment to another. and it is not the dull rattling off of a chain that was forged innumerable years ago. That's a very important statement. Attention is woven into the warp and woof of James' defense of your freedom, individuality, and ability to create your own unique experience. Because your mind is profoundly shaped by what it imposes on itself, he argued. Where you choose to focus it is vitally important. This conviction underlies many of his best maxims, such as the greatest weapon against stress is our ability to choose one thought over another, to choose optimism over pessimism, to choose smiling over a frown. Okay, these things are so crucial to what Buddhism is about, but to what the whole drift of the research in psychology and neurology is about nowadays. In his masterwork, The Principles of Psychology, in 1890, William James offered one of the earliest scientific definitions of attention, which is still admired for both substance and style. With an opening flourish as bold as it is disingenuous, he wrote, quote, "Everyone knows what attention is. It is the taking possession of the mind, in clear and vivid form, of one out of what seems several simultaneous possible objects or trains of thought. Focalization, concentration of consciousness are of its essence. It implies a withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others." And that's really important, especially in a world where people keep talking about multitasking, okay? That it's important to be able to realize you need to focus on what's realistic, okay? It means that by choosing something to focus on, other things are being ignored. And that's a fact of life. That's the way it has to be. We can't see everything with the same two eyes all the time. By the 1960s, neuroscience began to transform the study of behavior in general, and attention in particular, with new technology that revealed much more of what goes on inside the mind. At the National Institutes of Health in the United States, researchers recorded electrical signals from the brains of primates as they performed focusing tasks. Over the past 20 years, I made a note here. Oh yes, I was going to talk about the monkeys here, but I decided to talk about them right at the beginning. Okay, can primates focus? Well, we decided that they can, or so we've seen. Primates can really focus, huh? Research now suggests that, like consciousness or mind, attention is a term for a complex neurological and behavioral business that seems like more than the sum of its parts. There is no tidy attention center in the brain. Instead, an ensemble of alerting, orienting, and executive networks collaborate to attune you to what's going on in your inner or outer world in a coherent way that points you towards an appropriate response. The brain's partial and frontal cortexes are especially important to this process, but the sensory systems and many other structures are also involved. Indeed, every neuron or nerve cell shows some sort of attentional modulation. Neuroscience's truly groundbreaking insight into attention is the discovery that its basic mechanism is a process of selection. This is really important, right? This two-part neurological sorting operation allows you to focus by enhancing the most compelling or salient physical object or high-value mental subject in your ken and suppressing the rest. Outside an elite scientific circle, however, this finding's implications for everyday life have been stunningly unremarked. And that's a shame, isn't it? As the expression paying attention suggests, when you focus, you're spending limited cognitive currency that should be wisely invested, because the stakes are high. At any one moment, your world contains too much information, whether objects, subjects, or both, for your brain to represent or depict clearly for you. Your intentional system selects a certain chunk of what's there, which gets valuable cerebral real estate, and therefore the chance to affect your behavior. Moreover, this thin slice of life becomes part of your reality, and the rest is consigned to the shadows of oblivion. Attention's selective nature confers tremendous benefits, chief of which is enabling you to comprehend what would otherwise be chaos. That's what it is for so many people. I know so many people that are trying to do so many things, trying to see it all, trying to experience it all, that they don't understand the importance of focus, of becoming good at limited number of things that really enhance your life, that make a big difference in your life. You couldn't take in the totality of your own experience, even for a moment, much less the whole world, Whether it's noise on the street, ideas at the office, or feelings in a relationship, you are profoundly bombarded with stimuli vying for your attention. New electronic information and communications technology continually add to the overload. By helping you to focus on some things and filter out others, attention distills the universe into your universe. I'm just going to repeat that last one. By helping you to focus on some things and filter out others, attention distills the universe into your universe. Attention enables you to have the kind of Dionysian experience beautifully described by the old-fashioned term rapt, completely absorbed. That's what the word rapt means, right? Completely absorbed, engrossed, fascinated, perhaps even carried away, that underlies life's deepest pleasures, from the scholar's study to the carpenter's craft to the lover's obsession. This word carries away. I love the expression, especially in its relationship to the martial arts. When I think of carried away, I think of Wan Shu and the jump in Wan Shu. You know, when you really get that jump in Wan Shu, does everyone know what I'm talking about? Do you know the jump in Wan Shu? You haven't learned that yet? No. Okay. It's one of the most beautiful parts of any kata, where we leap high up into the air and do a 360-degree turn and end in a perfect back stance while we're doing a shuto. And whenever I think of the word carried away, because that carried away has a dual meaning here, that we are carrying ourselves away, way up, okay? But also that we get totally carried away, rapt, okay? Rapt attention. That this is the deepest meaning of the word rapt. The way we do this in martial arts. To me, I remember so many individual times when I did in demonstrations or just in practice or in class, jumping up into the air and feeling myself lingering in the air. You know that feeling, okay?
Yes, sir.
That you're in the air and you know it only lasts a split second, but not when you're doing it. You are turning around and experiencing yourself up in the air for a split second, but to you it seems like a long time there, that experience, and then coming down. Not only that, that as you're turning, you see this person, that bird, that tree. It's an amazing experience because you're turning around in a split second, but yet you see with such depth. We refer to that as a munokokoro, mind without conscious thought, that you become so rapt at something, so good at it, so expert at it, that you're not even thinking of what you're doing. It just happens spontaneously. You leap off the ground and you see things with a whole new vision than you ever had before, because your attention is so caught up in everything that's happening around you. It's truly amazing. I'm glad she really gets into this experience about, she's not talking about martial arts, but it enables me to talk about martial arts and this deeper meaning of what carried away really is for us. If you haven't learned Wan Shu, this is one of the more advanced katas. You don't learn it before several years of training, but it's an amazing experience once you learn this kata. The word Wan Shu means swallow, the bird, okay? And it's based upon, well, all the ancient martial arts katas are based upon the movements of animals. And this is one of the most remarkable katas. Some individuals slip into this state more readily, but research increasingly shows that with some reflection, experimentation, and practice, all of us can cultivate this profoundly attentive state and experience it more often. Paying a rapt attention, whether to a trout stream or a novel, a do-it-yourself project, increases your capacity for concentration, expands your inner boundaries, and lifts your spirits. But more important, it simply makes you feel that life is worth living. Isn't that true? You know? It just makes you feel that life is worth living. When I was doing my PhD, and as I was writing my doctoral dissertation and getting near the end of the process, having written hundreds of pages, locking myself into, I don't know if they still have these cubicles at the University of Toronto that graduate students, okay, so I had a cubicle and all my books were there. And sometimes I would be there like the whole day. Get in at like 8 o'clock in the morning and get a call from Francoise about 5 or 6 o'clock. Where are you? You never came for, you never met me for lunch. What do you mean? It's not lunchtime yet. I mean, she's telling me it's 5 o'clock. And I thought it was like 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. I thought I'd only been there an hour or hour and a half. You get so wrapped in something. I mean, it's truly amazing. Now, this is so unusual for me because I usually can't go 2 hours, more than 2 hours without eating. I've got to be eating every 2 hours. And I carry tons of sandwiches with me all the time because I've got to eat every 2 hours. Otherwise, I start getting in a really bad mood. Okay? I need to be eating continuously. You're like that, right? So it amazes me, when I think back on it. I mean, day after day, how this experience would happen. Not even to notice that you're hungry. But it's the most liberating of all experiences. But it takes concentration, focus, attention, which is becoming less and less available in our world. I know this more than most people because in 1970, when I began the dojo, and I taught students at the university, but I also had a lot of children. So I've been able to see children of 7 or 8 years old 40 years ago, 7 or 8 years old 39 years ago, 7 or 8 years old last year, and 7 or 8 years today. I do a lot of work at libraries where they hire me to come over and give sometimes karate demonstrations, sometimes recounting stories, sometimes both to the children there. And it just amazes me, the difference from that time in the 1970s and today. But even from last year to this year, it's been the most astounding drop in attention that I've ever seen. I just can't believe it. That years ago, you'd sit children down and you start recounting a story and they would be listening to you. And they would be totally involved from the first moment. And gradually, less and less. But this year, my gosh, from the first moment, they're fidgeting all over the place. They can't sit still. They don't know how to focus their eyes. They're looking everywhere. They don't understand what it means to be attentive, to pay attention to what's going on right in front of them. And it's really, really difficult. It's really a shame, that because these aren't my children, I don't have to worry about them, but this is a big part of what's happening to our society, because I see it in adults too. That really, it really disturbs me that so few adults understand how to concentrate, and they're not able to teach their children how to concentrate. What's going to be really difficult is that one day, when the Chinese take over Canada and the Japanese, because they can concentrate, and they'll be able to do things that our children will never be able to do, unless we make sure that we teach them what attention is about. Of course, martial arts is one way that they can learn that, but it's a shame that it's not something that is part of the culture around them. When I went to Japan, my gosh, the way the Japanese can concentrate, the way they are brought up from the earliest age, the way they are raised by their parents, the way their schools, okay? And many people might think, yeah, Japanese schools, they're really rigid. Yeah, they are. But they're rigid in many good ways as well as bad ways, okay? Maybe it's a little bit too conformist. It's true, okay? On the other hand, part of a Japanese school day, for primary school children, is they go to the room to eat. Unlike our culture, they go to the room to eat, whether it's, elementary school or high school. You have Pepsi Cola, Coca-Cola, right? French fries, fried fish, hamburgers, In Japan, you don't go into a cafeteria. You go into a kitchen. And this is elementary school. And the teacher will be there cooking, showing the children how to cut up vegetables, explaining to the children that here in Japan, we steam our vegetables, or put them in the wok, okay? Whereas in America, they fry potatoes, and they're called French fried potatoes, and they're full of cholesterol, and they're full of all sorts of stuff that's going to kill you, okay? We don't eat French fries in Japan. That's part of the lesson, okay? And they learn not just how to eat good foods, but how to prepare good foods, both the boys and the girls. Then after they eat, they go on a line, and they get their toothbrush from the teacher. Each one comes in a line. They're taught how to brush their teeth, okay? Reminded over and over again. It's one of the things that when my children were little, I took many occasions. You don't just teach a child once how to brush his teeth. You teach many times, because the technique is forgotten, and it's such an important thing. So this is part of the daily course in Japan, the way brush your teeth. Then you rinse your toothbrush, put it back in your place. Each child is like that. It's just amazing. Here, we just don't make the effort. By the way, in Japan too, martial arts is part of the basic curriculum. So that every child, it's taught in Japan that every child has the right to learn how to defend herself. Isn't that true? I mean, that's important. That should be a right that every child has. So it's really sad, that this sense of attentiveness, of being able to concentrate, of being able to focus. One of the reasons the research that we're talking about is so important, not only for our own lives, but hopefully maybe it can make a difference in the long term in changing the type of culture that we live in. I'm sure it must have been different when you lived in Russia.
It's a little bit like in Japan. Well, it's totally different than in Japan, but the rigidness was there for sure.
Yeah. The negative rigidness, or the also.
Well, I guess we benefited from it in some way. I would like to think that way. Positive thinking.
Yeah. I know when I was a child, one of the most important aspects for elementary school, but especially for high school, for the boys, was sports and athletics. That defined who you were as a male. Okay. Now, unfortunately, at that time, the girls did have a phys ed program, but it wasn't something that was so stressed. But for the boys, it was essential. But all that is gone now in the United States or in Canada. There's no real phys ed program. That's part of the reason so many kids can't concentrate, and why the boys in particular, since there's no athletics program, no place where they can sort of let off steam, they'll be fidgeting all afternoon in school. I would never have been able to survive through a system like that, because when I was in high school, boy, oh boy, we just lived for the athletics program. And we had such fantastic athletics teachers. But it's funny how this is so gone. But in Japan, it's still there. It's still there. That's why I say maybe one day, when they take over, because the world will belong to people who can focus, who can concentrate, and who understand the importance of high standards, and that we have to work to keep those standards, to make those standards. There's a sentence here that I love so much. Your ability to screen and select your experience, create order from chaos, and delight and fascination are attention's great benefits, but they exact a price. That little piece of reality that you tune in on is literally and figuratively far sketchier and more subjective than you assume. This underappreciated discovery has particularly important implications for your relationships and other social exchanges. Because different people focus on different things, even different aspects of the same thing, to say that someone lives in a different world is to speak the plain truth. It's important that we recognize that. It's one of the things that makes life really, really interesting. Okay, that we focus on different things. We see things differently. Boy, when you get married, you really realize that. Okay, one of the things that I valued very much when I got married is that my wife and I think very, very differently, and that makes things a lot more interesting. It would be very boring, okay, if we came to the dinner table every night and we discuss things and we agree on everything. Okay, we all see things the same way. It'd be terribly boring. Don't you think so? It'd be terribly boring. I don't know, maybe some of you are thinking, yeah, but my wife isn't, or my husband is like that. That's okay. But I'm just talking about something personal, because the other person fills in your mind, okay, with their experience, and you do the same thing. Now, sometimes that makes for arguments, but that's part of the process, okay? You learn from this type of thing, because sometimes you don't always see things that are very important and you each want to defend your ground. But one of the great things about a relationship, especially understanding, that more than likely, if you're a male and you're married to a female, your relationship, you're not going to see the same thing all the time, any of the time. Okay, but it will be such a loss if you were always seeing the same thing. I grew up in Far Rockaway on the ocean, where I would bring friends and literally make the ocean come alive to them as I taught them what it was to listen and to watch for. Part of the experience of being on the ocean. Whenever my friends, from elsewhere, would say, "You live in Far Rockaway, you must be very cold," because the winds come off the ocean and it's quite chilly in winter. And of course, a lot of people are afraid of the ocean because all the animals lurking beneath. But I would take them to the ocean, especially at night, where the ocean is really shows its magic. And they would have rocks piled on at different interludes, maybe every couple hundred meters. And so you can walk along the rocks and jump from one rock to another and go pretty far out, okay, while you're on the rocks. You have to be very careful that you don't fall in. But it's really remarkable to see that and to experience that and to feel the spray as the surf hits the rocks and gets you soaking wet. And sometimes you'll see fish, in the water, or crabs coming out of the water onto the rocks because they like to do that. And it was really something that was quite wonderful to experience. Myself, every day I would visit the ocean, and truly it came to define my life. It calmed, it energized me, it stimulated my imagination. What fish were right there, just by my side? Maybe a shark is right there, and I can't see it, but maybe he's right there. You look into the ocean, just imagining what type of life there is, just under your fingers, and can literally jump out at any time. But I mean, that rarely happened. It was just an amazing experience. But it's something that develops an appreciation of attention, of being able to appreciate something really basic in life, the ocean, the water, the spray, the animal life that's right next to you, but living in an entirely different world. I felt bad for people who could never experience that type of thing, who would come to the ocean and it's just something you play in, you swim in, okay, or you walk next to, or whatever else, and not understand the magic of the ocean, which comes from rapt attention to detail. I used to teach people about that if you watch the spray, you can see it in two different ways. You can see it as a spray, like seeing trees, like seeing a forest, or you can see the spray as the individual droplets that are coming before your eyes, which is like looking at the trees as opposed to the forest. And once you learn that, it's amazing to be able to see this. And it all depends on how you focus your eyes. Try that if you're ever, at a place, an ocean or a place where there's surf, you can see that, coming up on you. It's just really an amazing experience. Earlier I talked about saying in the dojo, it's not about punches and kicks to make you strong. It's about learning to focus, to concentrate, to build the power of mind that will give us the discipline to be truly strong. We have to always remember that martial arts is nothing without the ability to focus. You'll never be good in martial arts. But related to that, you'll miss out on so much of life. Like what I was describing about Wan Shu, the experience of being able to do that jump in Wan Shu, the experience of being able to learn all these katas and know what your capabilities are in self-defense, to be able to protect other people, not just yourself. These are crucial things. These are life-giving things. Most people do not possess that type of power. And it's an important thing to be aware of. But it doesn't come without learning how to focus, without learning how to concentrate. It breaks my heart when I see so many kids struggling, trying to learn how to kick and punch, but not understanding. They've got to concentrate. It's becoming a lost art. And we can't allow that to happen. Those of us who are here in karate, we can't allow it to happen to us or to our children. This is what martial arts is about. This is the legacy of martial arts. I wanted to read a couple of citations. This is from my book, Samurai Spirit. And sometimes you read this within the context of the story, but it's important to remember what these mean in the context of what we're talking about here. It is proper to doubt. People tell you one thing, and others tell you another. But when you realize that something is unwholesome and bad for you, give it up. And when you realize that something is wholesome and good for you, do it. Boy, such a simple piece of wisdom expressed in these few words. This from Siddhartha Gautama, from the Buddha. Okay, one of his most important speeches. I mean, it's amazing how important and how basic that is to living your life. That when something is unwholesome and bad for you, give it up. That's what focus is about. Because if you could focus on something, you would see that smoking tobacco isn't such a smart thing. Okay, and focusing on something like karate gives you the feeling that, yeah, this is something that is life-giving, that makes a difference for me and everybody who will know me. This is something that it's almost a no-brainer, but yet it is something that is so essential to life. This is one of my favorites from Bruce Lee. If we cannot conquer our personal fears, then a life of 1,000 years is a tragedy. If we can conquer them, then a life of a single day is a triumph. It encapsulates so much essential wisdom in there. What does it mean to live 1,000 years if we can't conquer ourselves, if we can't conquer our fears, understand who we are? The true mastery of an art is not the development of technique, but the mastery of self. Again, that emphasis on self-discipline, on understanding the self, on focus, on attention. An ordinary man, if he feels that he has been ridiculed, will draw his sword and risk his very life. But he will not be called a courageous man for doing so. A superior man is never alarmed, even in the most unexpected situations, because he has a great soul and a noble objective. That's Funakoshi, one of the great practitioners of martial arts in Okinawa. I'm going to read that again. An ordinary man, if he feels that he has been ridiculed, will draw his sword and risk his very life. But he will not be called a courageous man for doing so. A superior man is never alarmed, even in the most unexpected situations, because he has a great soul and a noble objective. Our ability to be able to train ourselves, to be able to focus on who we are, on being able to conquer our fears, because isn't that so much of what martial arts is about? When you start martial arts and you realize how much better everyone else practically in the dojo is than you, okay, and to be able to say, I'm not here to make myself, to flatter myself in how good I am. I'm here to learn how to conquer fear, to be able to turn a roundhouse kick that comes to your face into something that it's a joke. You can block it with no effort whatsoever. It takes time. It takes focus. Because if you're not focused, you're not going to see that kick coming in. The most basic thing about martial arts, okay? That arrow will come straight at you unless you're focused in being able to know exactly how to handle it. Maturity is the ability to make a decision and stand by it. The immature spend their lives exploring endless possibilities, then they do nothing. I'd say that's what so much of 21st century Canada is about, okay? Maturity is the ability to make a decision and stand by it. People like that are considered, a fanatic or something like that, huh? Like, you're a fanatic of the martial arts. You've got to be a fanatic if you have a brown belt and you study 3 times a week or something. Instead of respecting you for something that you do. That you're not just trying to do a million things, see everything, instead of focusing on what's going to make the difference in your life. The immature spend their lives exploring endless possibilities, then they do nothing. What a shame. When I was telling you the 2 morality stories before, and relating it to Buddhist monasticism, it's a difficult thing for me to talk about because I don't want to sound as if I'm being too critical of Buddhism. But even things that you love, you have to be critical of. When I was in Japan, when I was studying at Nihon Taikai Daigaku, it was an amazing experience. And I was so fortunate in so many ways that I was so close with my sensei, and he made all sorts of things possible for me. One of which is that I wanted to study at several of the famous monasteries in Japan. But because I was Canadian, I wouldn't be accepted because that's the way the monasteries were. You had to be Japanese. They thought Americans, or they considered Americans to be barbarians. We're going to dirty up their place. We're going to walk in with our shoes on. We're not going to have the sense to take off our shoes, to be clean, to be able to take a bath and boil yourself. The community bathtubs in Japan. But he made it all possible for me by sending me as his representative to teach martial arts. And so, because my teacher was so well known in Japan, they would never dare turn me away. And of course, he never said to them I wasn't Japanese until I arrived at their doorstep and knocking at the door in my gi, all ready to teach them karate. And because Michihara, my teacher, was such a well-known teacher, and the monasteries, well, the great monasteries knew that they were failing their students in a way because they had no physical exercise. Something we know so basic in Canada, that you've got to exercise. That's an important part of your health and well-being, right? And pleasure in life. But the monasteries, there's virtually no exercise. If you look at Buddhist monks, they are so pathetically skinny. Okay, it borders on the anorexic, and yet they're all male. It's just really pathetic. So at that time, they were asking Michihara to send one of his students, and several of the monasteries were asking him, send one of your students so that they could teach our students martial arts. After all, it's all part of the tradition of Buddhism. So as I say, they were shocked when they saw me coming at their doorstep. But it was a wonderful opportunity to work with them. When I came back to Tokyo, and to my group of friends, whom I was very close with, three of us in particular, myself and the gymnastics coach and the weightlifting coach, both had been Olympic athletes. And if you haven't heard me say this before, Nitadai was where all the Olympic athletes train, and we're all the greatest athletes in Japan because a lot of things aren't Olympics, like for example karate. So this is where the finest program in the country was. But anyway, the three of us have been very, very close. And I used to often have dinner with them or at their homes, with their wives. And we had many wonderful conversations. When I came back from teaching at the monasteries, they were aggressively questioning me. And I can see that they were not impressed with my enthusiasm for what had just happened. And the pleasure I had in teaching the monks and the friendships that developed there, and how, although they detested me at the beginning because I wasn't Japanese and something was sprung on them like that, they really came to like me because I was a good teacher and I was able to really get them to work hard. But they peppered me with questions when I came back, like, why would you want to go to these monasteries? Do you think that's what martial arts is really about? Do you think that's what the Japanese spirit is really about, what goes on in these monasteries? And they were right, because I was carried away with the enthusiasm of what I was doing there, and by the unexpected welcome I received. Not at the beginning, but as time went on. But they were right in the sense that they were angry about so much state money that went into keeping the monasteries. They were angry because, well, what I was talking about before, that when you have monastic life, some men become desperate and take advantage of it in horrible ways, much like the Catholic priests. That certain trusts are bestowed upon the monks that they are not worthy of. But there was something deeper than that, too. They were questioning me on the very nature of Buddhist monasticism and what it's worth. And I was defending it at first by saying, these men work very hard, and they're very dedicated to what they're doing. And they were saying, yeah, so what? So do painters work, house painters work very hard, construction work, garbage men work very hard. So what? They spend a lot of time studying. Yeah, so what? They don't do very much with their lives. Okay? They do teach from time to time, but basically they live amongst themselves, where they're kept on a very small diet. They're skinny. They're unable to do work. They would never survive having to do hard labor. They would never survive long-term martial arts, which was in a way true. But there was something deeper to it. And it was the fact that it sort of was a way out of having to live with responsibility. That, for example, my two friends, the gymnast and the weightlifter, they were married and had children, and they loved their children. And I thought they were terrific parents, all four of them. And, the two men I was friendly with and their wives. And they were saying to me that all this talk about peace and about calm and inner development and everything, it's very easy when you don't have children. It's very easy when you don't pay income taxes, because they don't have to pay income taxes, right? They don't have to do any accounting type of work, okay? All they can do is study their books all the time and sit in meditation for hours at a time. But how useful is that? And it's something that, as I say, they were questioning me personally, but it made me think a great deal as well. And made me feel very ambivalent, about the types of things that go on, especially with, like Japan, like in other countries, the scandals that inevitably occur as a result of monastic life, men living under rather unnatural conditions, you know what I mean? Just living with other men exclusively, not having exposure to women, not having children, not having a life. Anyway, it gives a lot to think about the good and the bad about Buddhism, the wonderful ideals of Siddhartha Gautama, but the questions about monastic life, which, by the way, began when he was still alive, okay? Why women couldn't be part of the monastic community, okay? This is when Buddha was still alive, and he was questioned by that. His own mother was questioning him about that. So there's problems there, okay? Like there is in life, okay? It's not all perfect, but I've always tried to look at the good and the bad. I'll tell you one of the funny experiences is that when I was there, I really disliked the meals. The food wasn't good, and there wasn't enough of it. And since I was supposed to be teaching them martial arts, I needed them to be eating enough. And I needed to eat enough. I'm the guy who needs to eat every 2 hours, okay? And I knew that since breakfast was at 4 a.m., probably lunch would be at noon. I don't like that, So I had to convince the headmaster that he had to give us more food. And I couldn't teach his students unless we had more food. I used to run every morning at that time, 10 kilometers every morning. So he asked me, okay, how do you start your day? So I'm running 10 kilometers every morning. Okay, my students will do that with you. I said, no, they won't, I mean, they're going to die doing that. He said, no, not my students. And he was right. I mean, they ran the whole 10 kilometers. These are people who were so skinny. I mean, they looked, as I said, anorexic. And yet they would die before they would give up on the 10-kilometer run every morning. I thought that they would die, but they have the will, huh? If only they had the food. So eventually, I got them to, give us more food, more often, and to have a breakfast that consisted of more than just miso soup, okay, with a couple of pieces of tofu, and a couple of vegetables, seaweed, and things like that. It's just not enough to be training on. But as I say, it's important to get a sense of what the Buddhist monastery life is about, and the good and the bad of it. Okay, let me turn my attention now to Hanson's book, Buddhist Brain, and I had been going over some passages. I got up to page 11, and I wanted to read a little bit of this, and then I want to move on. I don't want to read too much to you, but I just wanted to get you started on some of the things that are really important here. So it's page 11, the last paragraph, the causes of suffering. Although life has many pleasures and joy, it also contains considerable discomfort and sorrow. the unfortunate side effect of 3 strategies that evolved to help animals, including us, pass on their genes. For sheer survival, these strategies work great, but they also lead to suffering. To summarize, whenever a strategy runs into trouble, uncomfortable, sometimes even agonizing alarm signals pulse through the nervous system to set the animal back on track. But trouble comes all the time, since each strategy contains inherent contradictions, as the animal tries to separate what is actually connected in order to create a boundary between itself and the world, stabilize what keeps changing in order to maintain its internal systems within tight ranges, hold on to fleeting pleasures and escape inevitable pains in order to approach opportunities and avoid threats. Most animals don't have nervous systems complex enough to allow these strategies, alarms, to grow into significant distress. But our vastly more developed brain is fertile ground for a harvest of suffering. Only we humans worry about the future, regret the past, and blame ourselves for the present. We get frustrated when we can't have what we want, and disappointed when what we like ends. We suffer that we suffer. We get upset about being in pain, angry about dying, sad about waking up sad yet another day. This kind of suffering, which encompasses most of our unhappiness and dissatisfaction, is constructed by the brain. It is made up, which is ironic, poignant, and supremely hopeful. For if the brain is the cause of suffering, it can also be its cure. That's a good paragraph there, isn't it? Huh? For if the brain is the cause of suffering, it can also be its cure. So remember, we evolved as animals, or from animals, that reacted to danger by focusing on that and getting out of that danger. And that meant alarm bells had to be ringing. We're evolved from animals like that, and it's part of who we are. Because that part of a brain, what's called a lizard brain, okay? The lizard checking out everything all the time, and when something goes wrong, he runs, okay? Well, we're not lizards anymore. But there's still a part of our brain which is a lizard brain. And a part of our brain which is a little bit more complex, which is a monkey brain. But we're no longer monkeys. And then part of our brain which is human, mainly the prefrontal cortex, where we can plan out a future for ourselves. Think about art. All these wonderful things that other animals can't do. But it's mixed in with the lizard brain and the monkey brain, which makes us react like animals to so many situations. And remember, I was saying last week that the human brain is such that it turns on alarm buttons more than it brings happy buttons. Okay? Because in the ancient times, it was more important to protect the species from doing something wrong than worry about it doing something right. So the example being, of course, if a lizard is walking and he sees another lizard, okay, he might wonder, okay, is that a female lizard or is it a predator that's going to go after me? And the human brain is designed that if in doubt, you run the other way. So you might give up something good, but on the other hand, you're saving yourself. Well, it's an important part of our mental construction, and we have to live with that. But as we know now, with the plasticity of the brain, we can also transform ourselves from that. We don't have to live with a lizard brain, okay? We can go up to the higher stages of brain. More than 2,000 years ago, a young man named Siddhartha, not yet enlightened, not yet called the Buddha, spent many years training his mind and thus his brain. On the night of his awakening, he looked deep inside his mind, which reflected and revealed the underlying activities of his brain, and saw there both the causes of suffering and the path to freedom from suffering. Then for 40 years, he wandered northern India, teaching all who would listen. Number 1, how to cool the fires of greed and hatred in order to live with integrity. 2, to steady and concentrate the mind to see through its confusions. 3, develop liberating insight. Key points on page 18. What happens in your mind changes your brain, both temporarily and in lasting ways. Neurons that fire together wire together, and what happens in your brain changes your mind, since the brain and mind are a single integrated system. We've talked about this enough, but it can't be emphasized enough. What happens in your mind changes your brain. Therefore, you can use your mind to change your brain to benefit your mind and everyone else whose life you touch. People who have practiced deeply in the contemplative traditions are the Olympic athletes of the mind. Learning how they've trained their minds and thus their brains reveals powerful ways to have more happiness, love, and wisdom, such as the example of Siddhartha Gautama. The brain evolved to help you survive, but its three primary survival strategies also make you suffer. Virtue, mindfulness, and wisdom are the pillars of everyday well-being, personal growth, and spiritual practice. They draw on the three fundamental neural functions of regulation, learning, and selection. The path of awakening involves both transforming the mind-brain and uncovering the wonderful true nature that there was all along. Small positive actions every day will add up to large change over time as you gradually build new neural structures. To keep at it, you need to be on your own side. This is particularly important, right? Small positive actions every day will add up to large changes over time as you gradually build new neural structures. To keep at it, you need to be on your own side. Wholesome changes in the brains of many people could help tip the world in a better direction. Isn't that true, huh? Okay, so please take this seriously, because this is an amazing book, and there's some really interesting sections here. After all this discussion about visualizing happiness, developing attention, concentration, focus, and learning and earning your black belt in karate, a significant question is, so what happens? Does it work? In other words, all these things that we're saying, so does it make a difference? And for this, I wanted to bring to your attention some studies that we've done. Françoise and myself, as scholars at she at York University, myself at University of Toronto, and also the studies that were part of the Journal of Asian Martial Arts. Many of you have seen the journal. I don't know if you read through the whole thing, but an important part of that research was the fact that for children and for adults, we've shown overwhelmingly clear evidence that long-term martial arts changes completely who we are. I mean, it's amazing. When we set out on this study, we were worried, whether the data, whether the research would be sensitive enough to catch all the differences between people who are beginning in martial arts and people who ultimately get their black belt. What does it show to have a black belt in martial arts? Okay? And the results were, as I say, overwhelming. Using all the most important research tools in the field of psychology, that martial arts training in our dojo, real martial arts, develops incredible brain power. It develops capacities of the brain that, are, as I say, beyond our expectations. The ability to concentrate, the ability to focus, the ability to have self-respect like never imagined before. I mean, we took these variables one at a time, okay, as part of the study. And the people who were involved in the study, it wasn't just the two of us. I mean, we were the two main researchers, but it was just an amazing endeavor. Well, it was two separate ones, okay, one that was dealing with adults and one that was dealing with children. More specifically, my students at the University of Toronto, and only those who had attained black belts. We weren't interested in people who had green belts or blue belts. Why? Because it's not enough training, okay? I mean, martial arts takes time. Green belt or blue belt, 6 months, 9 months, a year. That's not enough to really have the capacity of what martial arts is about. But once you do 3, 4 years, okay, and you're on your way to black belt or black belt, that's a different story. And you realize from that, my gosh, 10 or 20 years, I'll be even better, okay? Because you realize that as you go along, your discipline gets even stronger. Your ability to focus, your ability to build those connections in your brain, right? Okay, even before we know it, because our research never talked about the neural circuitry that we're talking about now, because this didn't exist at that time. But it's an important thing to realize, okay, that these studies show that when you train in authentic martial arts, things really do happen. And you can look forward to the fact that they'll happen for you. But you have to be serious about your training. You have to know that it's not a casual thing. You have to do it. You can't dream about it. You can't think about it. You've got to make up your mind that if you want something that's really going to make a huge impact in your life, then you have to do it. It involves training. It involves carving muscle out of skinny arms. It involves carving a spirit that doesn't know fear. Okay? A spirit that nothing will defeat us. Samurai spirit means that we will never give up. That's one thing to read about it. You can read the book Samurai Spirit and say, whoa, that's a great book. You know, I mean, I wish I could do that. But we can do that. And we can make things happen. But we have to understand that it really takes sweat in every sense of the word. Okay? Because martial arts is a bit more encompassing than other physical activities. It encompasses our very soul as well as our physical training. So that's an important question. What happens from all this training? Is it worth it? Well, not after 3 or 6 months, you know, not yet, okay? But I think even after 3 or 6 months, you feel you're on the path. Isn't that true? You know? But over the long term, my gosh, you'll know what it's about. And everyone here who's a black belt or a brown belt, people like Mr. Caspi who's been in the dojo, is it 25 years?
24.
24, yeah. I mean, you know, when I started training, you know, the idea to think, you know, 40 years later, you know, I mean, you know, boy, I mean, I was just like any other white belt. I was really scared, you know, so what is this, you know, I mean, will I be able to do this, you know, and you see people doing incredible things that first night, and, but if, you know, you have to dive into the water to be able to swim, right? And it's a beautiful experience. One of the things I have for next week that I've planned for next week is an elaboration on what we were talking about tonight, what it means to be living in the world as a karateka, and particularly to have children. Because I was so impressed with the families that, you know, of my 2 close friends in Japan, and how they were teaching their children, you know, to be karateka, to be focused, to be disciplined. You know, I'd never seen anything like that, because that's not the way you bring up children in North America, okay? At least not the normal way, huh? And I thought that was so inspiring. But it means you can't be living in a monastery, you know. Not that I wanted to live in a monastery, but I mean, it certainly pushed me away from that type of, from being too overly impressed with that type of a world. Okay, that's it. Okay, so we'll see you in class as soon as possible. Okay, remember, train, huh? Okay, that's what it's all about.